Nindigenous Nimki Benesekwe, Dodam Makwa, Dodam Toronto, Nindunjaba, Timmins, Nishnabiyaki Nation, Treaty 9, Ninda. Good evening. Hello. In the language of this land and of my ancestors, I introduce myself to you and to them, the spirits and the ancestors of this place that we call Toronto. This is where I was born. This is where my spirit chose to come into this world. I've lived in Timmins, in the Nishnabiyaki territory, for the last 33 years. And I say all of this in order to introduce myself to you and to position myself within this world and within the realm of this place. I acknowledge the elders and the ancestors of Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation and all the others who have looked after this land for millennia. I also acknowledge all of us who are here, led by REDX and led by GIDT, for having the passion, the interest, the open minds to have these discussions about resource development. I acknowledge my teachers, the elders, the knowledge keepers, the ceremonial people who have shared with me so that I can share a little bit that I've learned with you. I've been privileged to learn from respected people who carry gifts that most of us will never fathom. I've been humbled to witness the healing relationships that exist between earth beings and spirit. And I've been empowered to skabe, to help, and to begin to learn the knowledge that is around me in the land where I live. And in being that skabe, it's a process of learning about yourself as a human being, for me as a woman, and a relative to all of life. And so I'm grateful for this life, and I'm grateful for the lessons that have come. My parents, in particular, shared with my siblings and myself a deep respect and a deep understanding of the lands, some of the lands that we were born to, here in Toronto, north of here in Georgian Bay, and Lake Simcoe, the original Toronto, and as well the northeastern states. In the tradition that we've formed tonight between my colleagues and myself, we were talking earlier this afternoon and we decided that we needed to tell our 8-year-old story because we all have similar 8-year-old stories of being those little girls. And for me, it was actually, I was in grade 8, I realized, but still it's 8. My mom is a speech coach. She teaches kids, and she used to teach kids in elementary school how to read speeches, how to write speeches, and how to be a public speaker. And so we'll always tease ourselves about whether or not we're enunciating properly or speaking from, which I don't do very well, so I'm just reminding myself. But there I found myself. I won the speech contest in grade 8 for Blessed Trinity Catholic School just up the highway there. And that was great. Then I went to the regionals and did the same speech and did really well. And then they sprang something on us that I didn't realize was going to happen. We had to do an impromptu. And so they timed us. We had 2 minutes to prepare on a topic that they had given us, and then we had to speak for 3 minutes. And so I couldn't do it. I got up. I said the first words, I'm going to talk about, and then I couldn't do it. I couldn't think and speak at the same time. And I watched the people in front of me first be sort of feeling sorry for me, and then feeling embarrassed for me. And that is something that stayed with me a long time. And so as I prepared this today, and I realized, oh my gosh, what a trigger. So I'm not that little girl anymore. And I will try to enunciate and pronounce my words properly. This evening, I'm going to take the great liberty of fast forwarding through the philosophy, the theology, the sacred knowledge that other people know very well, and that I am just at the very beginning stages of learning. The discussions about treaties and politics and language and human health and wellness, responsibility for our future generations are critical, and they need to be had by the people who carry that knowledge. The truth that I stand in, as shared with me by my teachers, is that spirit exists in all of us as human beings. It exists in the plants, it exists in the permafrost, the water, the air, the fire. And yes, it exists in the sacred sites and in the water that people will be doing ceremony for around Ontario tomorrow morning. At what point did I understand that? Was there a specific point in time? Yes. There was a pivotal point when I realized that I know the spirit in the water and the land, because I met it. 1,000 feet underground in a 100-year-old mine at a water pumping station. At that time, I was working in a company where every week we'd go on safety tours. And the idea was that the miners would explain to us, these experienced miners would explain to us about how they were using safety and what their philosophy of safety was. And as a manager in community relations, what I would do is try to stimulate a conversation with them about how the workforce was changing and how we could create a safe environment altogether. So that was the scenario. And here we were underground in this place, and there was a bit of a lull in the activity. And so I sort of turned around, and there was a puddle of water forming in the rocky floor, in the rocks there. And as I went to put that tobacco down, there was a moment of pure clarity that came. My light, shining on that space, that crystal clear water actually coming out of the back of the ceiling of that little rock cut that we were in. Pure water on that rock, and there was a moment of relationship that I knew. I met it. I knew it. It was there. It was that moment when I realized, and I knew it happened to be a full moon, just like today, and it was, I knew that night I would be honoring the water and the moon in a ceremony. And then that understanding happened. And the enormity of it, in a lot of ways, was that I wasn't in a teepee by a fire. I wasn't in a teaching lodge or in a ceremony. I was in a 100-year-old mine, 1,000 feet below the Earth's surface, a woman alone in a mine, and feeling that and knowing that. That knowledge was a confirmation of everything that my grandmother elders had been sharing with me about the sacredness of our relationship with the water and the land. And I realized and I knew it was a knowing that life that happens within that sacred relationship between water and land is everywhere. And it was also that realization at that moment of knowing what we do in mining, what we do, who we are actually interrupting, who we are working with. That sacred relationship between those elements. And it was a very positive moment There was nothing negative about that. It was actually too profound to be right or wrong. It was, and I knew it. I'd like to share another part of a story with you about how an unlikely group of people worked together to try to understand the land and the spirit that lives in that land in Timmins, where I now call home. Timmins is a place of resource development that is so abundant that actually the Timmins camp stimulated much of the economy for North America throughout most of the last century. That's how rich it is. And what's interesting is that as a kid growing up in Toronto, like literally right here, I had no understanding of mining. It was, there was an army buddy of my dad's who would, show up sometimes and offer my dad, an honor of, a piece of rock, something that he would bring from an ore body that he'd been chasing down somewhere in northern Canada. And for a young Torontonian, that was really romantic, but it wasn't real. It wasn't real like what was happening in my backyard or in my school. And so, again, I'm going to fast forward 40 years until I found myself in this situation, this responsibility that I was given to build a relationship between one of Canada's leading mining companies and the First Nations who hold the territorial land rights in Timmins. It was that opportunity that allowed us to take a risk. What we were trying to understand was the relationship that needed to exist in order to build an agreement. That's where we started. And so what ended up was that while that agreement was being formed, very well, very successfully, another relationship developed. And that relationship was between these knowledge keepers, a very particular, distinct group of knowledge keepers from throughout central Canada, and the people at the mine. And we worked together. We took risks for 7 years on how we were going to build this relationship. There were two key things. There was a few key things that happened, but one of the key things was that we understood that the land that we were looking at, the land that we were going to build relationship on, was being looked at in two different ways. The company has a way of looking at land as something that we need to extract resources from and take. Whereas these ceremonial elders, these knowledge keepers, they would only commit to helping us close the mine, not open new ones. And so it was a very interesting dichotomy that happened and that's where the risk came in. We took a risk together. It seems like in a very short little period I can sum up this whole work that happened over 7 years and all the challenges and the risks and everything else that happened into a neat little package that took place. But in fact, it wasn't a neat package. Neither the company nor those knowledge keepers would agree to be put into a neat package. The knowledge keepers were strict in their commitment to only closing mines and not working on opening them. The company hoped to honor their commitment to sustainability without realizing that their definition of that word didn't even include the concepts of Indigenous knowledge. The realities of budgets and bottom lines and environmental regulations and human fears and suspicions, setting precedent, health crises, historical traumas related to being separated from the land and broken treaties, all conspired to complicate the work and to often make it feel like it was chaotic and undirected. This was real. What some of us realized, and a few of us were able to acknowledge, was that yes, it was chaotic, but it was being directed by spirit. The unbalanced energy that has resulted from a long time of lopsided economics and, how can I say this? Not very open-minded engineering has created an energy that needs to be balanced. It's looking to be balanced. And in a lot of ways, it began to be because these knowledge keepers agreed to help us, agreed to tell us about the stories of the land. They agreed to talk to the land in the language that it would understand. And they also held the formulas. They could access those formulas of what it was going to take to rebalance the energy in that land. To begin to. What the spirit of the land we were working with wanted us to do, was to get to know it again. We were told that as women, we have a sacred responsibility to understand the land, to be on the land, to learn our ceremonies, to understand that water, to understand that rock and what it brings to us. Even the land that has been disrupted, it's been ripped and torn, even that land will help me when I ask it. It will heal me. The medicines that exist on the land, in every tree and plant, every soil and mineral and body of water, will work to help me, even as I learn to understand that they need to be respected for being part of creation. I can say this because I've witnessed it. For whatever reason, that little kid from Toronto was positioned as an adult to participate in helping to open a door to rebalancing hurt relationships between two different ways of understanding the land and how to benefit from it. We also needed to learn about cause and effect. We needed to experience cause and effect from a spiritual lens on the environment that we are all working to create. That 100 years plus of mining is not relegated to the past when it comes to the impacts on human health, on the air, the soils, the economics, and definitely not related to human health. Generations have already been exposed to risks for cancer and autoimmune disease. We know these things, but it's not just in those areas that have been contaminated. The water flows, the air moves, the dust is carried, the trees, that organic change that happens to trees when the bark is impacted, whether it pulls it up from the roots or it's impacted by dust, and then that wood is used to heat homes all over the country. Spirit moves. And when it moves from one place into another, it changes that place before it moves into the next place. The ones who take the responsibility for communicating with that, for understanding it, are the ones who are trying to teach us to respect the spirit. In Timmins, the knowledge keepers taught us about exchange. We began to learn about making an exchange for what we were asking for from the earth. We offered tobacco. We gave gifts. We listened to the stories. We learned some of the songs of that land. The people within the company, were given an opportunity to create their own relationships with the land in a new way, based on their own skills and abilities, their own roles within the company. And they also learned to give the responsibility for what needs to be done when we're asking the land for these things to the people who know how to do that work. Together, we identified some new answers to some old problems. Those answers included having a vision for the way a property needs to look when the mining is done. And that part of that vision means asking beforehand, listening to what it needs to be, even if that means deciding not to mine in a place where the land was never meant to be intruded upon. That's a big one. When we can open ourselves to listen, then sometimes those decisions need to be made. Was the work in Timmins perfect? Did we get there? No, not in any way. The harsh lessons we learned over those 7 years sheds light on the reasons why I share with you that nothing can be separated from anything else when we have these discussions. The environment is related to our health, it's related to our economics, it's related to our politics. And the way that we honor spirit in the center of all these discussions is how we talk about the land. However, a door was creaked open, ever so slightly, through the risks that everybody took together. And now that that door is open, we have an opportunity and we have a responsibility. The opportunity that exists is to heal a relationship between two very different ways of understanding the land. The responsibility is to use our distinct knowledges to find the solutions to the problems that we are creating, and not just for ourselves, but for the future. Earlier, I needed to take the time to position myself because this is a really big topic related to so much of what we are dealing with in Canada, and definitely within the discussions of resource development. I alone am accountable for my words. And I appear to stand here alone when I speak them. In fact, I'm surrounded by my ancestors. My teachers know the spirit of this place. And I know that my 4 grandchildren are going to carry the impact of my words. And most humbling is that the spirit of this place where I was born is listening to what we're saying. And it will feel the impacts, it will carry the impact of our decisions that we make as human beings, because the waters are going to carry those messages. The water is going to bring to here what happens in Timmins or anywhere else north of us. Allow me to share with you that I stressed myself out big time getting ready for this talk. To stand here and talk about the spirit of the land in a discussion about resource development. Who am I said to myself. What right do I have? And then, what responsibility? When we have been taught, when we have been put into a position, when we have witnessed because we were in that position, when we've benefited from the riches of this land, then we have a responsibility to be part of the discussion. The truth is that spirit exists in all things. It is the energy that gives life to all beings. It exists within us, around us, and it relates us to each other. It is the creative energy that positions us within this solar system and within this universe. Even though we are not talking about religion, we are talking about what is common in all religions, and that is spirituality. We may never understand each other's knowledge, perspectives, and that is simply not as important as respecting that we each carry something that we need in our circle. But please understand, we can no longer be foolish enough to resist what we each know because it's uncomfortable or it's inconvenient. You know, and we've heard it before, but it's so true from what I've learned, is that if we don't start understanding and learning from each other, listening to what each other knows, the rest of creation won't need us much longer. And they'll adapt to us as beings not being here. So, today, we are the human beings with ancestors who came from all different regions on this planet Earth, Mother Earth. And it was that knowledge that was gained by our ancestors, wherever and whenever that was, a long time ago, in all those different places on Earth, that allowed them to thrive. They fought for their land. They defended it from invaders. They built societies. And in the process, that land where we all came from originally, where we might have all come from, where our ancestors were, that environment may have bronzed our skin, or lengthened our legs, or given us the luxury of developing written language, or developing inventions, or all different kinds of things. But it allowed us to thrive in those places on Earth where we came from. Our ancestors understood the language of the Earth, where their blood came. It's the spirit that lives in those lands, that talks to the people, that shares the gifts, that develops the expertise that people have in all those different areas of the world, and that they've brought here together in this room. In the same way that the geography shapes how we live our lives, it's the spirit of those places, that land, that influenced what we know about how to live. We are the human beings who are now privileged to call each other's lands home. This morning, I got to spend the morning with my 1-year-old granddaughter, who lives about 3 blocks away from here. And, this is a little spitfire of a girl, just over a year old. And she looks like her dad in some ways. She looks like her mom in some ways. Her other granny and myself were there. And I tried to wrap my mouth around what Charlotte calls her other granny, which is Vovo. Because her other granny is from Brazil. She speaks Portuguese. There's a whole richness of world in that little girl. And then I know what we carry in our family. So that little girl is one of those human beings whose bloodline comes from all over the world. And I thought about that. I thought, I may not understand at the end of the day what that little girl is going to grow up to know. I'm not going to necessarily understand what spirits, what language of the earth is speaking through her when she develops her skills and her gifts. Her other granny may not understand. Her mom and dad may not understand. her aunties. But does that make it any less valid? That little 1-year-old is a reflection of the whole possibility of the world. And what language chooses to come through of her is where she's going to change the world. Is it not time that we learn to ask each other what we know about the land, how we communicate her, why we disconnected from her, what language she speaks? Is it not time to respect those parts of creation that we may not understand and the people who do? I believe that the benefits of these discussions will outlast any one of us, even our grandchildren, who will acknowledge us as their ancestors for leaving them in a sustainable world that is measured in oxygen and water and carbon. Thank you, all my relations, Miigwech, Niganagana.